Hello everyone, Somber here. Because it's still the holidays and my all Warhammer Nation Scathe and Blight game is still on a bit of a hiatus at the moment, I thought I'd take the opportunity to make another national overview video for another one of the Warhammer mods for Dominions 5. So today I'm going to be looking at the Dwarfs. There's the individual mod, which is at version 0.51. As of time of making this video, and of course that's also part of the compilation pack Somber Warhammer, which is at 1.29. So what I'm going to do is take a look at the kind of broad overview of the nation, and then I'm going to go through the troops, the commanders and heroes. I'm going to look at any national spells the dwarfs have, and some national items they have as well. And then I'm going to give some thoughts on scales that you might want to use with the nation. I'll put a link in the description to get to the mod and places you can discuss the mod as well. But yeah, I'm just trying to give an overview of the nation. It's not really a guide on how I think they should be played, particular strategies or research goals or anything like that. I'm not going to look at pretender design. It's really just to kind of whet your appetite and give you a sense of what the nation is like, to see if you'd maybe like to play with them. So here is the national overview for Dwarfs, Ancestral Grudges. Got a description of what the nation's kind of about at the top there, and then let's just go through the national features before I talk about the troops. So the race is hardy dwarfs with excellent morale and magic resistance, and they really do have very good morale and magic resistance, and they prefer cold scale 1. Their military is made up of superb heavy infantry and crossbows, and they have better than usual crossbows. They actually have a different weapon than the normal crossbow. And as you can see from the lineup, they do not have any cavalry, it's all infantry. And they tend to have very high resource costs, which of course is suggestive of what scales we should be taking, but we'll talk about that later. Their magic is strong earth, some fire and astral, and then minor access to water and air. They use rune magic, which is weaker in battle, and they're immune to drain. So again, that's a suggestion about what scales you might like, but it's really something that's going to be worth noting is that the rune magic is specifically weaker in battle, but they do have some mages who have extra ability to forge items, so that's a strength of the nation. They've got powerful priests, so they do have a Holy 3, and their priests are sometimes protected by ancestor spirits. So this is using the guardian spirit mechanic, whereby if a priest is in battle and the enemy is sufficiently threatening to him, there's a chance, based on how powerful the priest is, I believe, of a particular unit turning up to help him. And in this case, it's the ancestor spirit unit, which I'll have a look at the end of the troop segment. Their forts cost 150% extra because the dwarfs are kind of a nation in decline. They're not really an empire that's expanding. Their forts are more expensive, but they have advanced forts, which means that they start with 3 command points in their capital, so they can recruit commanders faster, recruit mages faster, and more of them. And they also have engineers that can build better forts. So they can get up to very high level forts that have 3 command points each, and they also have very strong walls and lots of supplies and so on, and they'll give you more an admin bonus, so you can get more out of it, but of course you have to invest time and gold into that. And the extra expense of their forts, this 150%. So if you were building a palisade that's normally 600 gold, it will be 900 gold instead. You can see that's a severe increase. And when you're doing the upgrades, it applies as well. So they are an extra half again as expensive when you're making the upgrades. But your forts do produce 15% more resources, which helps with the high resource cost of the various troops and commanders. They also have a mechanic whereby they can discover and defend special sites, and these appear in mountain and cave provinces that they control. And once you've discovered those, after a period of time has elapsed, well, each turn you have a chance of those being essentially dismantled and that upgrade being sent back to your capital to upgrade your capital. And that kind of represents that the dwarfs are trying to reclaim a former glorious empire. They've got kind of runes and things that they can go and seek out, and they want to bring those back and protect them. So there's kind of that aspect of having to keep hold of things, reclaim and then keep hold of your former glory. So as usual with my mods, you can see that I've got these preview sites, and I've put these in to allow the player in the national overview, or other players, if they look at your national overview in the game, to see things that you would otherwise have to use a mod inspect, or you'd have to run a test game to see. So here you can see some summons, which I will go through a bit later. You can see their multi-heroes, and you can see their heroes they get through events that are not tied to the luck scale. So I'll go through those in a bit, but I thought I'd also, just before I start talking about the troops, talk about their starting sites. So they've got 2 of their cap-only recruits coming from this site, and this is their gem income. They start with 1 fire and 2 earth per turn, and they have no additional gem income because they've got the Vault of Gromril, gives them 50 more resources, but these 2 sites have no effects because they need to be upgraded in order to provide things. So you're starting off with a lower income in terms of gems. You do have a production bonus, but as you discover these sites and send them back to the capital, you will increase your gems, and I will talk about that a bit later. So let's get on with the troops now. So the first troop to look at is the Clans Dwarf Warrior. This is your basic infantry, your basic troop, and so I'm going to talk about some of the features that dwarfs have across the board here. So pretty much all dwarfs have mountain survival. They have a siege bonus because they're very used to siege warfare. They're very good at building tunnels, building war machines. Their warriors are also, they're kind of part-time warriors, but they're also craftsmen and so on. And they've got 2 points of castle defense bonus. So if we look at their siege, they end up for 20 gold, which is your basic troop. You've got a siege strength of 2.2, which is it's roughly equivalent to what you would get if you had a couple of 10 gold basic humans. So they're not really gaining a bonus from having the siege bonus there, apart from also being good troops and not really having that as a disadvantage because they're expensive and it's harder to mass more of them. But in terms of castle defense, they are ahead of the curve by quite a bit because their castle siege defense ends up at 1.6, which is quite a bit more than what you would normally have. You can see that each point of the ability of castle defense is about as effective as 1 human defender, so they're pretty much as good as 3 human defenders in terms of defending a castle. They've also all got dark vision. Some of them have a little bit more dark vision, but 50% dark vision is good enough that you can take advantage of fighting in cave provinces that have natural darkness, and also if there's a supernatural darkness like the darkness spell, things like that, they're less affected. They only lose half as much to their stats, which means that if you're fighting against things that don't have any dark vision at all, you should still come out quite a bit ahead, so that's quite effective. And the Clans Dwarf Warrior has Formation Fighter because the dwarfs are very used to fighting in formations, kind of a shield wall. And what Formation Fighter 2 means is that if every infantryman in the square has Formation Fighter 2, then they can fit an extra 2 points of size into the square. So each of the Dwarf Warriors is size 2, which means normally you would fit 3 of them into a square, but with Formation Fighter 2, they fit 4 into a square. And that means a couple of things. One, you are outputting 4 attacks each turn with these dwarf axes, which are very nice, rather than just 3, so you're more easily able to do more damage to the opponent who may have just 3 infantry in their square. The other thing is that it distributes the hits that you're taking amongst those 4 dwarfs, which means that each individual dwarf is less likely to end up taking fatal damage, in fact less likely to end up being harassed down or getting hit at all, because of course you take harassment penalties the more often you get attacked. Another thing that all dwarf troops have is as it says here, dwarf troops gladly use their own wealth to support the military efforts of their nation and require only a quarter of the usual upkeep in gold. So normally, a unit like this would require an upkeep of 16 gold per year, which is so here you're paying 4 gold a year for them because it's quartered. Upkeep is each month, of which there are 12 in the Dominion's year, you pay 1/15 of your gold cost. So that's why it ends up at 16 rather than 20. And yeah, they're 1/4 of that. Now, that does a couple of things. So firstly, on thematic grounds, one of the things that's very important for me to get across as the maker of this mod when you're playing with the dwarfs is that I want them to feel like every lost life, every dwarven lost life, is something that's unpleasant. It feels bad to lose them. Now, always it's going to feel a bit bad to lose troops, but with some nations it's like, I lost some troops, it's fine, they don't cost very much. But with the dwarfs, in addition to them costing a fair bit, 20 gold for your basic warrior, the fact that you don't have to pay very much upkeep on them means that the longer that they're alive, the more benefit you're getting from that. So they are units that you're able to mass long term, and you really want to keep them alive if at all possible. It just kind of puts a bit more emphasis on that, the value of dwarven life, whereas the Skaven or the Orcs and Goblins, or even human nations that have cheaper troops like Bretonnia has their peasants, I talked about that in the previous video, then they're less interested in just keeping them alive. Another thing about all the dwarfs is that they tend to have equipment which is the equivalent of some existing piece of equipment in Dominions, like a shield, a helmet, or a chain cuirass, or an axe, and they'll have an improved version which has better stats, but it also tends to cost more resources, which is why you end up with this, which is a relatively kind of medium to heavy infantry with protection 15, because he's got 13 from his armor, but then he has some basic natural protection, which all dwarfs have. So he ends up being relatively tough, but he costs a lot in terms of resources. 20 gold, 32 resources, 15 recruitment points. The bottleneck there is likely to be the resources. Now, all dwarfs also have nice hit points, lovely magic resistance 13 instead of the normal human value of 10, so that's very useful, just keeping them effective troops throughout the entire game, because later in the game there's lots of things that can absolutely destroy troops that don't have enough magic resistance. And the same is true of morale. They have 13 base morale, and there are lots of troops that suffer from just not having enough morale later in the game. They have good stats. They have a base attack skill of 11 and a base defense skill of 10. And they have a little bit extra strength. So they're kind of on par with like elite human infantry, not quite elite in terms of attack and defense skill, but superior human infantry, let's put it that way, well-trained human infantry. But then they also have these excellent physical attributes of the magic resistance, their higher morale because they're a very doughty, stubborn, and kind of they're loyal to their brothers. They have this sense of honor and not retreating in combat, which is good because if they do end up retreating in combat, this is where they really suffer. Their combat speed is only 5. Dwarves are great in terms of moving strategically. Their map move is absolutely fine. They have 18 map move base, which is very high, and then they have the armor penalty. But when they're in combat, their low combat speed can be a problem. They take a while to get to the enemy. If the enemy routes, the dwarves are not very good at running them down. If the dwarfs rout, you can have a disaster on your hands because even though you're still pretty tough, you don't repel enemies anymore when you're routing, your defense skill drops when you're routing, you've likely already taken some damage, and you've only got combat speed 5, so you're going to keep getting hit as you try to retreat. So a rout can be very bad for a dwarf, so that's something to bear in mind. Now, they also have encumbrance of 2 rather than 3 at base, but they do tend to wear heavy armor, so they end up still being a unit that can kind of get tired in combat, but a little bit less than a typical heavy infantry, maybe like Ulmish heavy infantry, which is something that people tend to compare the dwarves with quite a bit. So this unit, I would say, is perfectly fine for expanding. It's a very nice heavy infantry unit. It's expensive, so you're not going to have a huge number of them. And of course, because they're in formation fighter, they're going to be packed into a smaller space. And that's something that you'll really want to bear in mind when you're scripting the armies. But yeah, they're very efficient at just kind of sitting there, holding the enemy in place, not taking much damage, not dying because they've got good protection and the extra hit points, and just hacking the enemy up. 19 slashing damage from the Dwarf Axe. Absolutely great at hacking things up. So let's take a look at the next one, which is the Clansdwarf Heavy Warrior. These are completely identical stats and abilities, except they've got heavier armor. It's as simple as that. So they've got the plate hauberk instead of the chainmail cuirass, and they end up with protection 20, which is very good. We're into the proper heavy infantry at this point. Their combat speed remains the same, and that's because I made this, I gave the combat speeds to the various units in this mod such that all of the dwarf infantry, except for some special ones that are a little bit faster, they all end up with combat speed 5. And I've made that a universal thing across the board, which makes them easier to script, kind of easier to handle their armies, and represents the fact that the dwarfs, despite having this heavy armor, are very used to wearing heavy armor, and they're very kind of endurant, they're very tough, they're very disciplined, they move in these kind of solid ranks, and so they all have the same combat speed. So you can mix in your heavy warriors and your Clansdwarf warriors, and they won't split apart because of their different combat speeds. Now, obviously, this costs a lot more resources. It's 46 resources versus 32 resources, so a significant increase. When you are able to spend those resources, when you are not tight on resources, you don't need to mass them, you will always take the Clansdwarf Heavy Warrior, basically. It has an extra point of encumbrance, but that extra protection is well worth it. So yeah, definitely worth having the Heavy Warrior as your kind of resource sink unit. So next up is their missile units. The first is the Clansdwarf Crossbow. Now, they have very similar stats to the Clansdwarfs that, the melee ones, the Clansdwarf Warrior. They don't have a shield. Their armor is a bit worse, but they still have protection 14, it works out as. They still have a Dwarf Axe, which is an absolutely fine melee weapon, hit hard. They can make an okay account of themselves in melee, basically. But the crucial thing about them is that they have this dwarf crossbow. So if you look at the stats of the dwarf crossbow, it's basically an improvement over a regular crossbow in every sense. It's very similar to the steel crossbows that the Agarthan troops use in the late era. I think maybe they use them in middle era as well. I'm not sure, but they get these special steel crossbows. But of course, unlike the Agarthans, they have better precision. Precision 10, absolutely fine when you're using this crossbow because it gives you an extra precision 3 built in. So the dwarf crossbow is very effective. Something to bear in mind with it, of course, is that this is something that has 14 armor piercing damage, which means that it's quite possible for you to hurt your own troops that have protection 15, let's say, and hurt them quite badly. So friendly fire can be an issue with these. And so I would suggest pairing them up with units where, if they're going to be shooting next to your units that are in melee, I would suggest pairing them up with your melee units that have shields, because they'll be able to use the shield against friendly fire as well. Now, they cost an extra 5 gold, but the fact that they're still okay in melee, they're not at all very vulnerable in melee like a lot of archers, and the fact that they've got this very nice dwarf crossbow, I think well worth building some Clansdwarf crossbows as your basic shooting line. In fact, you may wish to have more Clansdwarf crossbows than you do warriors. Then you have the Clansdwarf heavy crossbow, so it has identical stats, but then instead of the axe, it has the great axe, and there's really no disadvantage to that because the basic Clansdwarf crossbow doesn't have a shield, so you're switching a one-handed weapon on its own for a two-handed weapon, so your damage is much higher, and 23 damage is very tasty, and this means that there are units which normally would feast on archers. They would be able to flank round the sides, particularly because the dwarfs are less likely to have flankers on their side because they don't have cavalry, and they would end up attacking your archers. But of course, these guys can hit back plenty hard. Yeah, I think that you don't want to underestimate how good these are in melee. They also have, instead of the crossbow, an upgraded arbalest. So the arbalest, like the Ulmish arbalest, only fires 1 every 3 rounds, so it's slower firing, but it does more damage. It does 4 more damage, in fact, and of course, it also is armor piercing, so their protection is half. So those 4 more damage is more important than a typical increase of 4 more damage because it's armor piercing. They also have very slightly better armor, although really the main thing that's doing is pushing their resource cost up. So again, we've got a bit of a resource comparison here. 33 resources against 44 resources. So again, a fairly significant increase. The main thing I would say about these, picking between these and the crossbows, is if your enemy has very high protection, then you might want to have the arbalest. And the arbalest hits so hard that it can actually break through like a tower shield unit that has not the best armor that it's wearing. It's relying on the tower shield to block things because they can do enough damage to punch through the tower shield and still harm and, in fact, sometimes kill the unit. But the downside of having this, apart from the fact that it fires less often, so it's less good against things that don't have very much protection, or you just need to get a mass of fire out there to do things like, break the glamour on some elves, for instance. The downside of this, mainly, in my opinion, is that the friendly fire is that much more devastating because you are a race which has superb heavy infantry and lots of heavy infantry, and many of them do not have a shield. So that's a serious concern with the arbalest. It can even punch through your shields and armor to do friendly fire damage, even if your guys do have shields and block it. So it's much more dangerous to use willy-nilly without worrying about what it's going to be shooting at. So next up you have your first kind of upgraded infantry, which is the Longbeard. Longbeards are old veteran dwarfs, but they don't have the old age tag because I basically dislike it in Dominions, and in the lore they're supposed to be pretty much better at fighting than younger dwarfs. So they are old enough that they may end up hitting their max age and getting old age penalties, but it's not super likely. It will happen if they get decayed or something like that, so it's something to bear in mind. They do have a little bit more encumbrance than other dwarfs because they're getting a bit slower and older. They've got increased attack skill, increased strength, but slightly decreased hit points because, again, they're a little bit older. But the main thing that they do have that's a big benefit is they have an extra point of magic resistance, and they also have an extra 3 points of morale. Finally, they also have an extra 1 point of siege bonus and an extra 3 points of castle defense. So in terms of sieging for their gold cost, and in terms of siege defense, they're just better for the gold than the normal dwarfs. They are limited in terms of recruitment, though. So they require, I can't see here how many recruitment points there are, but it's more than the typical dwarf. But also, they're limited to only recruiting 5 per turn per fort. So I would say get Longbeards when you can. There's lots of situations where they're considerably better than the other dwarfs if you're running into ore, things like that, if you're worried about routing. If you need to hit a little bit harder, because they do hit a little bit harder, because they're extra strength. then they're great. In a long-term fight, maybe their encumbrance is going to come into play and cause some problems. But yeah, I would generally recommend getting the Longbeards that you can, so you can get 5 of those each turn. Next up, we have the Ranger, and this is. Have I skipped over any? No, I haven't. Sorry. The Ranger also has a great axe, so again, a very hard hit. And this is in a way similar to the Rangers that late age Ulm gets, but they are considerably better in melee. So they're a lot more expensive too, of course. But having the Dwarf Great Axe in there, 23 damage, and it's attacking at attack 12 because it gets +1 attack. Very nice in melee. They've got okay armor, protection 15 like the Clan Dwarfs. They have the same, magic resistance, morale, etc. But they also have dwarf throwing axes. So these are, if you compare them with crossbows, each turn they're going to make 2 attacks rather than the crossbows that make 1 attack every 2 turns. So they've got 4 times the output of projectiles. They're very imprecise, and of course they're short range. They've got 3 ammunition, which means in total they're going to get off 6 shots before they run out of ammunition, because they get 2 for each point of ammunition. So they'll be hurling in these throwing axes from short range. If the enemy gets into melee with them, Rangers do absolutely fine in melee. They're not so good against armoured things because these aren't armour piercing. But if things aren't particularly well armoured and you just need a volume of fire, they're better than crossbows in that sense because they can just absolutely pelt things with these throwing axes. I think that makes them very good. They also have extra survivals, which allow them to move around the map more easily. They have snow move. They have forest survival. They don't have swimming because they're still dwarfs and they still wear fairly heavy armor, so they can't be swimming across rivers or anything. They have the normal cast defense bonus and siege bonus. But yeah, the use for these guys strategically, the main important thing there is that they are stealthy. They're only stealthy 40, so they're not super stealthy troops, but you can certainly use them with a stealthy commander to do some raiding because a small number of them will do just fine against most Brother's defense. Next up, we have another stealthy unit, although they're stealthy for a different reason. The Rangers are stealthy because they can sneak around, they can do reconnaissance, they can kind of trail and ambush the enemy. The Miners are stealthy because they are moving underground. So because they're moving through these ancient dwarven passageways and they're kind of unblocking them and making new passageways and setting up traps for people that would use the passageways for themselves, the Miners get to move underneath obstacles, which means they do get swimming because they can move underneath rivers. They get snow move because who cares about the snow, and they get all of the terrain survivals because again they don't care what's happening on the surface, they're just moving underground past it all. They also have, because of their ability to tunnel and their picks and just their knowledge of kind of siege works, they have excellent siege bonus. So for the gold cost, these guys are your super siegers. 6.2 for 25 gold cost, absolutely great for that. They've also got the usual cast defense bonus, and they've got an extra 25% dark vision. So if you are expecting to be fighting in caves, then this is probably the best unit for that. They are also recruitable in all caves. So if you do find cave provinces, you don't need to have a fort there to recruit miners, although you may have difficulty getting enough resource to get very many of them. When they're actually in combat, the miners have not great protection. Their protection drops off a bit, so it's 14 rather than 15, which is the normal for the clan dwarfs and so on. And they cost a bit more, but their stats aren't any better. But what they do have is a very hard-hitting weapon. So the Dwarf Warpick hits at 24, which is even harder than the Dwarf Great Axe, and it does piercing damage, which again knocks the enemy armor down by another 20%. So 20% of the enemy armor is gone, and then you're hitting for 24 damage. They can puncture very, very tough things with this. The difficulty with miners is they're just a little bit more likely to take attrition and damage than the other troops. Because they're moving underground, they also have stealthy, and their stealthy is better than that of the Rangers. They have stealthy 50, which is, I believe that's the magic number for troops being counted, just stealth plus. So I would definitely recommend using these in raiding groups. If there's cave provinces, you can make more of them, and they're great at fighting in caves. If the enemy has very heavy armor, the Dwarf Warpick is excellent for bashing through that, but bear in mind they don't have shields, and their armor's a bit worse. Next up, we have what is essentially the first of the kind of niche dwarf units that's a real specialist, and this is the Troll Slayer. Now, Troll Slayers are dwarfs who have gone through some awful shame that is so bad that they vowed to die in battle. Their purpose is just to die in battle, and as such as you would expect, it's kind of a glass cannon unit. They've got extra strength, they've got 2 weapons, they go Berserk, they've got Berserker 2, which is a decent value of that. But they have terrible protection considering they're dwarfs. They're also a bit faster. They've got extra combat speed because they don't have that armor. They're running ahead to get into battle. They're eager to, go and kill and die in battle. Now, you might think, oh, well, they're just going to get slaughtered in large numbers and they're quite expensive. And yeah, potentially that is true. They can be a bit of a gamble in that sense, but it's nice to have faster troops. They have excellent morale. They have many of the other benefits that dwarfish troops have. But in addition, they also have two things that are very special about them. So the first is that the Slayer Axe has an extra effect if it manages to damage the enemy. Is triggered. It's the slaying weapon, which does 6 damage if you're the same size as them or smaller. So if you're size 1 or 2, it just does an extra 6 damage. So if you've got good protection, that probably won't do very much. If you roll very well, it will do something, but the strength of wield is not added, so it's just 6 against whatever the protection is, even after you've damaged them. But if they're larger than you, it's times 3. So against cavalry, against trolls, giants, things like that, even against titans and super combatants and thugs, big things, that 6 damage becomes 18. So if you do manage to hit them and do even a single point of damage with your normal attack, you then get to roll an 18 damage attack, which has already hit them, against their protection. So you can really get in some extra hits. I think the most common use of this is going to be to manage to get in hits against cavalry and kill them if they've got pretty good protection and shield and so on. You manage to get in, nip them for some damage, and then the slaying goes off and does a significant chunk of extra damage. They've got 2 Slayer axes and they've got ambidextrous, so they know how to use them. And yeah, they can therefore, even though they've got attack skill 11, which is okay, they're get 1 each on these Slayer axes, 1 extra attack each, so that's attack 12. But of course, because you're putting out more attacks, then you're going to cause more harassment penalty and you're going to hit more often. They don't have formation fighter, they don't fight in a shield wall, they fight in just 3 of them per square. And the other thing about them is they have a magic bear tattoo. So the tattoo says it gives limited invulnerability and strength to the unit. Now, a value of 2 in bear tattoos gives you 2 extra strength, which again, if you couple that with a berserker, you'll end up with your strength at 16, which is very high, and you're going to be doing then an additional 4 damage on your Slayer Axe. I think 4 or 5, because the strength scales in a slightly odd way. But yeah, you'll be doing extra damage with those Slayer Axes. And the other thing it gives you is invulnerability. It gives you invulnerability 10 once those tattoos are activated. If they're not activated, this doesn't do anything. But you can activate them with the dwarfs, unlike some other Dominions nations that use a spell to activate tattoos, like Marverni or Soramashia. The Troll Slayers are activated by having a specific commander in their presence at the start of the battle, and I'll go through that when I'm looking at the commanders. Next, we have another specialist, the Iron... Oh, actually, before I go to the Ironbreaker, a thing that's very important to point out about the Troll Slayers is that they have low resource cost. So they are one of the few units that you can just pump out a bunch of if you don't have that many resources. Sorry, my headset cut out just then. If you just need troops quickly, then the lower resource cost is very, very welcome. Now we have a unit that's basically the opposite of Slayers, which is the Ironbreaker, which has extremely high resource cost. This is amongst the very highest resource cost for troops in the game. I think in the base game, only Anakites have something like 100 resource cost, the ones with magic weapons. And you also have magic weapons with the Ironbreaker. You have the Ironbreaker hammer that does a magic attack and does 19 damage, which is very welcome. It also has another effect that I'll go through in a moment. But the key feature of the Ironbreaker is just that it has absurd protection. It's very similar to the Ulmish Black Plate Infantry, where it just has this fantastic armor and a shield. So protection 23, because of their natural protection kicking in as well, and a shield on top of that, and their defense and attack skill are improved. These are elite Dwarven infantry. They've still got pretty good map move. Because they are dwarfs. They've still got combat speed 5 because they are dwarfs. They have all the usual dwarven benefits, although they also have an extra point of castle defense because they are experts at protecting dwarven holds from threats from below. That's their main thing. They also have an extra 25 points of dark vision because, again, they're fighting in the depths against all manner of horrors below the dwarf holds. So this is all very nice, very welcome. Plus, better magic resistance and better morale. So 15 morale, absolutely fine, good enough. And 15 magic resistance, just excellent. So these are long-term usage troops. The other thing they have going for them is that the Ironbreaker Hammer, in addition to being magic, which is fantastic if the enemy has anything ethereal, invulnerable, or if they have a mist form, I believe it can also pop that. Magic is just a fantastic thing to have in a recruitable unit. They also have this ability whereby, if they manage to do damage, then they get this iron breaking test, which checks for magic resistance. If you fail your magic resistance roll against that, you take 1 extra point of damage, although it can only be 1 extra point of damage, and your armor becomes broken. So, If they're against enemy heavy infantry, they can really smash their armor up. What they'll do is just kind of stand there against the heavy enemy infantry. They'll grind against each other. The Ironbreakers should come out on top because of their good stats and their excellent protection. And as they score hits, they'll break through that magic resistance, and the enemy's armor will start falling apart. And once it does, those hammers will just absolutely mulch them. So Ironbreakers, very good at killing enemy heavy infantry, and almost unsurpassed at just staying alive, just like absolute units in terms of staying alive. But of course, very high resource costs and also 25 recruitment points. So 30 gold, 87 resources, 25 recruitment points. You're not going to have a huge number of Ironbreakers. Your cap will be the amount of resources you can put out to just keep putting these into the field. Another unit that's a kind of elite infantry and very good against enemy heavy infantry is the Hammerer. Now these have limited recruitment, so you're only allowed 5 of those per fort per turn, and they have very high resource cost, and they now have a higher gold cost. And the main reason for this is that they hit like an absolute truck with their Oath Hammer. 26 damage, and it's magic. They just blow holes in things. Believe me, once you use hammerers, they may not look on paper like they're that much more exciting than, say, Ironbreakers or Longbeards, but when you see them in combat, they just kill stuff. It just gets mulched. They still have absolutely fantastic protection. They still have great magic resistance. They have 16 morale, which is like the Longbeards, very, very high. They also have 4 points of bodyguard, and means that if the enemy is an assassin that has patience, this can counteract it, which means they're more likely to turn up when the enemy tries to assassinate that commander, so they can make excellent bodyguards for your important commanders. You shouldn't need very many of them to win the combat either, because they're so elite and strong. They also don't have particularly high encumbrance because they don't have a shield and their armor is a not terribly encumbering form. So they can last quite a long time in fights before they get tired and start taking critical hits and so on. Yeah, just generally a very elite heavy unit. I would recommend building them for sure. And now we're moving on to look at the Dwarfs 3 Sacreds, which are all fairly different. So first we've got a capital-only Sacred, the Rune Guard. You've got another magic weapon here, and this magic weapon has very nice stats, an extra 2 attack and 1 defense. Very, very welcome. This Specialist Hammer. Yeah, just more magic damage is always fantastic. They are very expensive in terms of gold resources and recruitment points. They have all of the usual drawbacks of being dwarfs, but their attack skill and defense skill is, excellent. They have superb protection, even better than the hammerer's protection. They have a shield on top of that, so they're more similar to the Ironbreaker in their kind of general protection and ability to stay alive, but they kind of hit a bit more like the hammerer, so they're kind of the best of both worlds. They also have fire resistance 5 built in, which coupled with their protection means that armor piercing fire attacks just won't really do very much against them at all, things like fireballs, stuff like that. Also gives them, I believe, invulnerability to things like heat auras and being exhausted from fighting in very hot climates. So these guys are very, very useful. They take a bless very nicely. There's a lot of different blesses you can use on them. You can use reinvigoration to get over their encumbrance. You can give them extra strength. They hit harder. 20 is already quite hard, but you can always benefit from hitting harder. You can give them extra attack and so on. There's a lot of blesses that you can use with these guys, but they are capital only, and of course they are quite expensive. So you have to bear in mind you're not going to have a huge number of Rune Guard. Something that I do want to point out about them is that normally a Sacred unit would have half the upkeep of other units in your lineup, but because the Dwarfs already have their upkeep cut to 1/4 for all of their troops, the Sacreds are the same. They just have 1/4 upkeep rather than it being like a halved again to 1/8. It's just 1/4. Next we have the Doomseeker, and this is a build anywhere Sacred, but it's limited recruitment of 1, so you're going to get 1 per fort per month. These guys are quite different from the Rune Guard. The Rune Guard are, quintessential heavy infantry. They stand there, they grind through the enemy, they bash them down, they have magic weapons. Doomseekers do not have magic weapons, and they're much more like Slayers. So they're faster, they have not much in the way of protection, they go Berserk, and they got Berserker 3, which is very respectable. Once you have that, your attack skill and strength go way up. They are bad formation fighters, so they don't like to sit in squares with the Dwarfs. They go off on their own because they're just whirling around, whirling their axes everywhere. They have the Magic Bear tattoo, so again that would give them invulnerability 10 if you awaken that tattoo, and an extra 2 strength, so they hit super, super hard. They've also got Unsurroundable 2, and what that means is that when the enemy attacks you usually get harassment penalty. Your defense drops the more enemies attack you as you just get overwhelmed. So the first 2 enemies that attack them don't cause any harassment penalty. So even though they're kind of standing in a square on their own, they're quite able to survive just by their higher defense skill. to a certain extent, they're able to avoid being hit. If the enemy has high attack, they will just get hit, and they'll end up dead because they do have good hit points, but they don't really have the protection to get away with that. In terms of their attacks, they have two very nice length 3 attacks. The axe heads, although they have a reduction to their attack, they do have a bonus against shields because the chains can wrap around the shields, and the axe head will get you in the neck because these are axe heads attached to long chains which attach to their arms. And then they also have another attack which is called the Whirlwind of Steel. So this does less damage. These are very high damage. This is less, but has better attack rating, although the attack rating doesn't matter because it has area effect 1. It cannot be repelled, which means that if the enemy is relying on defense, well, this just completely ignores defense. They're just going to get hit. They're going to get hit, and they're going to take quite a bit of damage. So against things that are high defense, low protection, the Whirlwind of Steel absolutely mulches them, turns them into a red mist. And that can be fantastically useful. But you're never going to have very many of these guys, and it can be quite difficult to keep them alive, which is bad because they're 50 gold. So they're very much a specialist unit. I would use them against things that masses of enemies that don't have super high protection but have pretty good protection, are expensive because you can justify the cost of losing Doomseekers against them potentially, and are maybe more relying on their defense. But against those enemies, this functions absolutely brilliantly. Then finally, you have a Build Anywhere Sacred that is not restricted in any sense other than its recruitment points, resources, and gold costs, which are still fairly high. 50 gold is quite expensive. Now, I would say that the Valkyrie is very similar to the Rune Guard, but it's basically worse because it's not capital only. So if you're building Sacreds and you're in your capital, I would recommend taking the Rune Guard basically always over the Valkyrie. But outside of your capital, especially if you've got a good Bless, you may want to have some Valkyries. So Valkyries have a couple of things that are unique about them. So the first is that they've got a magic weapon, which does extra damage against demons. So on damage, it does an extra 10 armor-piercing magic damage, but only against demons. So if you are up against demons, I think this means that your damage output is, way up there, basically. It's very strong, having that extra effect. They also have a special shield, which has got more protection and better parry ability than other dwarven shields. And they have more defense skill than most dwarfs. They have all the other things, the siege bonus. They have an extra point of cast defense bonus because they are the protectors of these sacred sites the dwarves have. But yeah, just the fact that they end up with defense skill 15 with their shields can make them quite survivable against things that don't have particularly great attacks. They'll end up hitting the shield fairly often because 18 protection plus 18 protection, is quite a chunk. So yeah, a bit more shield based and a little bit more vulnerable to a little bit less vulnerable rather to friendly fire as well. So you may want to use them if you've got a large number of arbalests and things firing away, where the rune guards and particularly the hammerers without their shields would have more trouble and you'd have more friendly fire. So that's your basic troop lineup. These are all recruitable. You've got one that's recruitable in all caves and you've got one that's capital only. But then you also have some summons that I'll just briefly mention. So this is the ancestor spirit that turns up as a guardian spirit if your priest is threatened by an enemy, and it can even turn up in assassinations. It is a very, very, very nice unit. It has excellent stats, better than most dwarves. It is ethereal, which makes it much harder to hit. It has some of the invulnerabilities and things that ghosts typically have, although it's a magic being rather than an undead. It's sacred. It has fear, the base value of fear, but still very nice. It has a super hard-hitting magical great axe, which is also does curses when it lands a hit. But look at those stats and look at that damage. Really, really, really nice weapon. And unlike most ghosts, its armor is not really ghostly. Even though it is ghostly, it still works its armor, so it is still wearing armor, which means that it has protection rather than having protection 0. It has protection 13, despite being ethereal and having the other benefits that ghosts have. 20 hit points is also not to be sniffed at. So really like a super elite super dwarf that is sacred, has fear, very good. If you were building these units, they would probably cost, I don't know, they might even be like 100 gold plus each. So very expensive. But the way that you get them is they all appear. There's some summons to get them, but generally speaking, they'll just appear to randomly turn up and guard your priest sometimes. And that is pretty much all of your mages are priests. There's also the Thunderer and Iron Drake, and these are two troops which you can get through summons, and I'll talk about the summons when I'm talking about the national spells. But also, if you manage to upgrade your capital sites to Tier 3 or Tier 4, and I'll talk about how you do that a bit later, you will get, for one site, you will get the recruitment of 2 Thunderers per turn in your capital, And for the other site, you'll get 2 Iron Drakes per turn you can capital. So that's why they have these costs associated with them. They're very expensive in terms of resources, but what Thunderers give you is long range, armor negating shock damage. They also have shock damage they can deliver in close range with their Thunder Staves. Yeah, this can be absolutely devastating, and they also have shock resistance 5. So I will maybe talk a bit more when I'm talking about the summons, the Thunderers, but pretty much this is a unit that gives you armor negating shock damage, which is always very exciting to get hold of. You then have the Iron Drake, which is kind of a bit of an opposite end of the spectrum. It has very high protection because it's basically an Iron Breaker with a flamethrower/club. They can club people with this weapon, the Fire Drake, and when they do so, they always get alchemical fire spilling out of it. Area effect 3, 11 armor piercing damage, fire and magic. So that is fantastic against massed enemies that don't have the best protection. It can even hurt things with high protection. Because it's area effect 3, it can also hit the Iron Drakes or friendlies that are nearby to them, although that's less often going to happen than when it's hitting the enemy. But they do have fire resistance 5, and with their high protection, they will not hurt themselves, basically, with their own flamethrowers. But you may want to use them with other high protection things or things that have fire resistance to avoid, friendlies getting roasted sometimes by their attacks. Very nice unit to use and very different from the Thunderers. There's also Bugman's Rangers, but I'll talk about that when I'm talking about the hero Bugman, because he is the only way that you'll end up with those basically special Rangers. I'll just quickly show you the stats, but you can see they're basically just better versions of the Rangers that use crossbows instead of throwing axes. And these I'll talk about when I'm talking about summons a bit more. So that's all there is to say about the troops, and I'll move on to the commanders. So let's have a look at the commanders. So your first commander is the Rune Bearer, which can also be recruited in all cave provinces. So even without a fort, you can get those from caves. This is best thought of as a national scout because it has stealth and it has all of the standard movement that the miners have because it travels underground. It has very high map move, which is very nice. It's kind of got the map move of a very fast cavalry unit because it's got all these runes that allow them to run very fast through the secret dwarf tunnels. He's also got a couple of other features, which is he's got 3 misc slots instead of just 2, which I don't think is really enough to turn him into a particular kind of like a mini thug or anything, even though he comes with some inbuilt reinvigoration rather. But I would say that this could be useful if you're just having a scout transport some items around. The fact that you can stick 3 misc items on him might be somewhat useful. But yeah, I wouldn't really go turning this into a thug, but if you're into it for the kind of comedy potential, just because you find it an interesting challenge to see how cheaply you can turn these into effective thugs, you could in theory do that with them. Another thing they can do is they can lead a small number of units around, and they're particularly good at leading the miners because the miners have the same ability to traverse all kinds of terrain as they do, and they've also got stealth. So not a bad scout. There's some interesting things you can do with it, but he is relatively expensive for a scout and not terribly remarkable. Then there's the Ranger Captain, which is kind of a basic stealthy commander. He can only lead 20 things, although he does have okay leadership rather than the -1 to his morale. He's got a crossbow, so he can fight from the back if he's leading rangers. He doesn't have the throwing axes that they use. And he's got pretty good stats. And of course, because this is one of my Warhammer mod nations, and he is what I would call a tier 1 mundane military commander. He gets unsurroundable 1 and a little bit of extra magic resistance and more hit points and things. So he's a little bit more able to fight in combat, close combat, and make a decent account of himself rather than just dying. So you don't necessarily have to have him just stand at the back. He can do some other things. Basically, they're there to lead rangers around, though. They're less good for leading the miners around because they don't have all the survivals and the swimming that the miners have. But yeah, good for leading rangers around. He's got okay stealth and lead a few troops, so not too bad for that. Then there is the Prospector, who can also be recruited in all caves. And the Prospector really is your leader of miner units. He's a bit more expensive than the Ranger Captain. He doesn't have a ranged weapon. He just has the pick, the same as the miners. Basically the same equipment, slightly better armor than the miners. He can lead 40 units. He's an okay commander. There's no plus or minus to the morale. He can't use formations, but he does have all of the same map move that they have. Another advantage he has is he gives decent siege bonus, even better than a normal miner, and he's got a 15-point resource bonus. So that resource bonus is kind of, if you think about it as being like half of a clan's worth of resources, it's not very exciting. But you can station a handful of these guys in a cave province, And by being in the Cape Province that doesn't have a fort, they allow you to have more resources there, and that might let you pick up some more miners without having to build a fort. So that's a potential use for them. But I think this is more of a theme thing. It's not terribly important because you're not going to have tons of these guys sitting around just for the purposes of giving you more resources. So yeah, there's your prospector, good for leading raiding parties because he's got the stealth and he can lead miners across all different types of terrain. He's also got an enchanted helmet that gives him 100 dark vision, so particularly good in caves and in darkness. Next, then, we've got another kind of a specialized leader, and this is the unit that you would want to use to lead Troll Slayers. And that's because, in addition to being very like the Troll Slayers, so a little bit faster, berserking, has inspirational but poor leadership, so doesn't do formations or anything. And they've got the same tattoos as the Slayers, the same weaponry as the Slayers. They have two things about them that are particularly interesting. The first is that they come with this built-in Mark of Drengi. It's an item that's cursed but can't be found, so effectively this is just like built into the unit, and it gives them permanent luck. Luck is the 75% chance to ignore anything that would kill you. Unless it causes instant death, like Soul Slay, something like that. But any other attack that would be fatal, such as somebody just chopping into you with a big axe, something like that, if it would kill you, then 75% chance you just totally ignore it. So they actually can be quite difficult to kill, particularly once you've got the tattoos awakened and they have their 10 invulnerability. So these units automatically cast Awakened Tattoos on the battle start. And Awakened Tattoos is a spell with a fairly small area of effect that they will aim at any themselves and any slayers that are nearby in order to awaken their tattoos. So what you want to do is take a giant slayer, give him some slayers to lead perhaps, he's got 10 leadership, he can lead a handful of slayers, and you put them together such that at the start of the battle he will hopefully get both them and himself with this Awakened Tattoos, and they'll all get the invulnerability and extra strength. If you want to make sure of it, you can have several giant slayers around like a big blob of slayers, and then you get better coverage from that Awakened Tattoos spell at the start. Oh, I guess it's worth saying that individually, they've got pretty good stats. They're not amazing because they're still kind of tier 1 military commanders, and they can, you might want to target large and go after things with the Slayer axes because they're only 1 command point each and they're not super expensive. But really, you're better off just using a big assortment of Slayers than relying on the Giant Slayer to do that much. So your next commander then is your more traditional basic military commander, the Thane. The Thane has 80 leadership, so you can now use formations, which is great. It's particularly good for the dwarfs because they don't have that many units that are going to be taking place in battles, and their units, quite a few of them have formation fighter, and of course they're all size 2, so you don't have particularly good coverage of the battlefield, and having formations allows you to do things like use sparse line and line formations and things like that, just to make sure that your dwarfs are covering the ground that you need to, and make sure that enemy cavalry can't flank through and things can't charge through the centre and so on. So it's really nice to have those formations. He's only a single recruitment point, commander point rather. You do get 3 command points in your capital because of your good forts, and you can upgrade the other forts to be 3 command points as well. And yeah, so you may find that you have the spare recruitment points to make some thanes along with your mages and things. I'm hoping that they're useful. They're not bad in terms of being thugs. They've got pretty good stats, but there's nothing really there that would make them particularly great if you chuck a bunch of items on them. Maybe you would put some items on some of these guys as kind of budget, like spellcaster thugs. If you put like a Wand of Wildfire, something like that on them, they do have 11 precision. But in general, not the best chassis for a thug. You can do a little bit with them. The other thing they have is they are tax collectors because the Thanes are in charge of administering various different regions. And to remind you, tax collector allows you to take gold income from a province even if it has no path that can be traced to a friendly fort. So these guys are good to have around if you've got if your forts are all getting put under siege, you can't trace income anymore. It's nice to have them, and they're also good just leading a force that's kind of forging through enemy territory, and you don't have to keep a link to it in order to keep grabbing the gold as they kind of charge around smashing stuff. They don't have stealth, so they can't raid in that sense, but they're perfectly fine in the usual kind of, in the normal kind of raiding where you're just avoiding big enemy armies and just taking out province defense as you go along. So next we have a bit of a special commander, the Engineer. It's worth thinking of these guys as fulfilling 3 functions. So one of them is that they bring a huge amount of siege bonus and castle defense bonus, 40 siege bonus, 30 castle defense bonus, and they also have Mason. And the unit in the base game to compare them to is Middle Era Ulm's Master Mason, I believe they're called, who come with 30 siege bonus and 20 castle defense bonus. So these guys have significantly better siege and castle defense. They're also, Masons, just the same as the Master Masons, but the Ulmish Master Masons are 60 gold and 1 commander point instead of 100 gold. So these are a bit more expensive, but they have 2 other features. They have an excellent ranged weapon, the Engineer's Arbalest, which is very accurate and does a lot of damage. So it's, you can aim at like large enemies, something like that. It can actually do fairly decent damage to even things like Titans, stuff like that. So a nice weapon to have firing from the back line, as you are brought along for your kind of siege and castle defense. But the third thing they have is they automatically cast Aim at the start of the battle. So Aim is a spell which is Area of Effect 1. I think it adds 4 precision to anything that it's put onto. I might not have that exactly right, but I think it's 4. And the Engineer, basically you could have a squad of 3 of these guys standing, 3 of these commanders standing in a single square. They would all cast Aim. One would cast it definitely hitting all 3 of the engineers. The other 2 would cast it on something nearby that needs to be given Aim. So missile troops or mages. So if you scatter these guys out amongst your mages and missile troops, they'll just give you some extra precision. It's a bit difficult to control exactly where they're going to end up casting that. It just represents the engineer giving some kind of trajectories and firing advice to nearby units, or maybe using it on themselves. But just mixing some engineers in with your mages, I think, is good if they're using evocation battle magic. Although the dwarfs not great at using evocation battle magic, you do also have arbalests you can put them near to get that little aim bonus. I don't think that this is terribly important. The main thing about them is that they're bringing along this big siege and castle defense bonus, and of course they're masons, which lets you upgrade your castles 1 more level. So next we have your, this is your 2 command point units starting basically, and the Clan King is your premier deluxe military leader, mundane military leader. You've got leadership 120, that's 4 squads, he can do formations just like the Thane. He gives 2 morale bonus. The morale bonus, I have to say, is a little bit less important for the dwarves because their base morale is just so good. They don't really need that big morale bonus like something like, say, Imperial troops or Skaven, Orcs and Goblins, things like that with the lower morale units that need a good boost across the board. But this guy is nice to have as a strong leader. He is sacred, which is nice because he will take a bless very happily. He is unsurroundable 3 because he is a tier 3 combat commander, kind of cream of the crop, basic recruitable combat commanders. I shouldn't say basic, you really are kind of playing a deluxe price for a deluxe military leader here. And you get a unit with fantastic stats, 29 hit points, 13 strength. We love to see that kind of thing. 17 magic resistance. Excellent, 17 morale, but also he has very nice equipment, including the Great Axe of Grudges, which we previously looked on the Ancestor Spirit. So that is magic damage, very high damage, does curses, which can be good for at least kind of either getting them onto a very unpleasant thug or enemy pretender if you do manage to damage them, or scaring them off because they know you can curse them. And yeah, the Clan King, I think, it's worth having some of these guys, and it's probably worth putting some items on them. I think by this point, your stats, your unsurroundability, your hit points are good enough to justify some items, but they don't need that many items because their equipment is already so good. It could be that you're just giving them boots and misc items, things like possibly if you can get some regeneration on them, you can use some of the natural items, can give them some interesting abilities, and you could maybe give them some rejuvenation so that they can get their reinvigoration to get their encumbrance back, rejuvenation to heal afflictions, things like that. So next we have another two command point military commander, mundane military commander. So he doesn't have any magic, but he is holy, he is sacred. He also has 2 upgraded versions of the Slayer Axe, so these are getting very high damage now, considering that's 2 attacks, considering that he will Berserk +4, so very high levels of Berserk, considering that he has Magic Bear Tattoo 2, and thus will get +2 Strength when his tattoos are awoken, as well as 10 invulnerabilities. And of course, just like the Giant Slayer, he automatically casts Awakened Tattoos. So if you need the leaders just for the purposes of Awakened Tattoos, you're better off getting 2 Giant Slayers instead of getting 1 Dragon Slayer. But the Dragon Slayer is much more frightening in combat. He puts out a lot more damage, and he is just, in general, better at getting this Slayer going off on the larger enemy types. So if you need to kill a particular thug, you can just potentially send even an unequipped Dragon Slayer, may be able to go and take them out. It might be nice to get some other items on him. He does have 3 available misc slots, in addition to the one that's taken up by this Mark of Drengi that comes built in. So yeah, he can. This is kind of representing that the Troll Slayers and Dragon Slayers and Giant Slayers, they end up just picking up a lot of kind of unusual loot off the various enemies they destroy. The Dragon Slayer, just for a bit of lore, is a Troll Slayer who's managed to kill a troll and become a Giant Slayer, and then has managed to kill a giant, and then they're given the task of destroying a dragon, slaying a dragon, then they become a Dragon Slayer, and this is where even the best of them tend to die. They have Affliction Resistance 3. Affliction Resistance 3 means that they are, I think, a quarter as likely. Yes, it's a quarter as likely to take an affliction if they would normally get one as a normal unit. And of course, they still have luck. Just as an aside, this is to represent that the Slayers want to die in combat, gloriously, to erase some kind of past shame or some trauma that they can't get over, and they can't continue to live as a normal dwarf. So they take this vow. They have the strange haircut. They have tattoos and war paint they put on, and they fight without armor. But some of them are cursed, seemingly, to just not be able to die. As much as they might want to try and die, they're not going to die without a fight, and they just keep winning those fights. And that's kind of what lucky represents. So kind of a double-edged sword for them, or double-edged axe rather, because they would rather die than keep going, but they're just not allowed to. So now we're moving into the priests and mages, and it's worth noting that your priests and mages are all sacred, at least some of them are priests. The Runesmith Apprentice is not. The Priestess of Valaya is a level 1 priest, but they can also research. They give you 9 research for 120 gold, and they're sacred. So their research efficiency over 3 years is not bad. I believe it's on the lower side of 1.6 research points per gold. So they would be the most efficient researcher in a not terribly efficient at researching nation. They're not for the dwarfs, but they nearly are. They're not bad. So you can use them as researchers. The problem with just hiring them to be researchers is that, of course, they don't have any magic. So when you want them to stop researching and do something else, like sight searching, casting spells, forging, or fighting, they are less useful for that. What they do have going for them is that, like the other dwarf mages researchers, they are mundane researchers. They don't care about drain scales, which of course suggests that you should probably be taking drain scales with your nation because it's free points. And they have Healer 1. So Healer 1 means that every month they will heal 1 affliction from a random thing, a random affliction from a random thing. Well, there is an order to the affliction they can heal. They start with the easier ones in general. But yeah, you have the ability to heal afflictions. That can be very important. You can have, they're not quite as effective if you just have them walking around with an army, because they're just going to be healing afflictions off the troops. But given that you can have very elite dwarf troops, like maybe you've got a Priestess of Valaya walking around with 10 Rune Guard that she's blessing and they're going off and fighting in combat, then the ability to heal one of the afflictions that they're getting each turn is very, very useful. But the main thing that you would use Healer for is specifically when you know that an affliction will be really bad for you. So, for instance, you have an expensive mage that's got an affliction that's very bad. If you've got a Mind Hunter who's been casting Mind Hunt, you can cure them of their Feeble Mind, which makes Mind Hunt a lot less risky, although the dwarves are not really a Mind Hunt nation. But also, if you've got a pretender, like a Titan who's running around fighting things, it can be very annoying if they get an affliction, and these healers can clear it up very easily. You just need to make sure that they're off in a province with just them and the thing you want them to heal, because otherwise they'll heal other things potentially. So that is a very nice thing to have. I wouldn't recommend hiring this as your main researcher. As I say, they're not mages, but it's worth having some, and maybe having some move around with your armies just to heal your units of their afflictions. So we're moving into the mages now. Your Tier 1, your very basic mage, is the Runesmith Apprentice. They have 1 Earth. They have this random, which is Fire, Earth, and Astral, so they can get to Earth 2. They could be Earth 1, Astral 1, or they could be Earth 1, Fire 1. Those are useful cross paths, potentially. Particularly Earth 2 can be useful for some battle magic. And then they have this 10% chance of some extra bits, such as getting into air and water. Don't worry about this too much. You're not going to make... I mean, if you make a lot of them, you will get some of these 10%, but it's really not something you should count on, so I'm just pretty much going to ignore it for the moment. And you do have other routes to those paths. They are also mundane researchers. They also have 9 research points, but they only cost 100 gold rather than 120, so of course they're more gold-efficient researchers than the Priestess of Valaya. they also give you a resource bonus of 10, which, so for the prospector, we talked about that not being a big deal when it was 15, but it is more of a big deal for the Runesmith Apprentice because you're going to have a bunch of these sitting around in your capital or some other fort, and they'll just be passively giving you research bonus as they do their main job, which is researching. So that's actually pretty nice to have. Now, there's a note here at the bottom that says this practitioner of rune magic has no penalty to magical paths in combat. And the reason that that is noteworthy is because all of your other mages, your runesmith, your journeyman runesmith, and your rune lord, they do have a penalty to magical paths in combat. So, if we're thinking about the role of these guys, in addition to being your researchers, anything that's at Earth 2, you might want to be sending into battle because it doesn't get a decrease, which means it can be Earth 2, it can cast Summon Earth Power, and then it's at Earth 3, and then it can cast Legions of Steel, which is excellent on your high protection, high armored units. It can cast Strength of Giants, which is excellent on your various units. There's a few other things it can cast. It can cast Earth Mold, things like that. So it's definitely worth considering that you'll have some Earth 2 of these. 1 in 3 of them will be Earth 2, and you can use those as battle mages. Moving on to the Runesmith, this is your kind of mainline mage. I would say it's going to be doing a lot of your heavy lifting. It's kind of the core of the nation's magic. And the Runesmith does get a -1 penalty to all non-holy magical paths in combat, but he is level 2 priest. So these guys, when they're in combat, that -1 means if you're at 1, you go down to 0. You just don't have that path at all. If you're at 2, you go down to 1. Pretty straightforward. The paths that you have are 1 fire, 2 earth, and then your randoms are the same 100% random, and then a 10% random, except it doesn't have the astral that the Runesmith Apprentice has. So if you get astral 1, then in combat you're going to be just an earth 1, which is no good for doing anything really. If you get 1 in 3 of them gets that extra point of earth, they go to earth 3, so they can do things outside of battle that require earth 3, but in battle they'll just be an earth 2, so they'll be doing the same things of summon earth power, strength of giants, etc. So yeah, they're not very good battle mages. Now you can do things with communions to get these paths up from 0, because they are still there, they're just reduced to 0. So if he was in a communion and was getting a boost of 1 to everything, the fire would reappear at level 1, for instance. The two other crucial things about these guys, so they're okay at research. You get 15 points of research for 200 gold and sacred. That's not as good as your more efficient researcher in the form of the Runesmith Apprentice, not by a long shot, but it's not bad. So you can have these guys researching on the basis that you've got them available to do other stuff as well, and they can do things that involve them being Holy 2, although this is, Holy 1 and Holy 3 are what people tend to be more interested in because they see this as being a price you have to pay for something that's not terribly interesting being Holy 2. But the most interesting thing about them is this pair of abilities. So they have Forge Bonus 1, which gives you a 1 gem discount on anything you forge. So with a Dwarven Hammer, you get a 3 gem discount, which means if the item costs 5 gems, you've now got this basic unit that can forge it for just 2 gems, which is very exciting. It's not as good as what a middle-age Ulm can do, but you have a bunch of other advantages, the most important of which is that you have Master Smith 1. Now, Master Smith means that Master Smith 1 means you get 1 extra path, 1 extra level in every path you have for the purpose of crafting magical items. So, if you have one that is Fire 1, Earth 2, and then let's say they've got Astral 1 and they didn't get their 10%, you can now forge things that require Fire 2, Earth 3, and Astral 2. So that lets you forge quite a lot of different things. It gives you surprising reach having Master Smith. If you're lucky enough to get water or air, you're at water 2 straight away for forging purposes, air 2 straight away for forging purposes, and you're going to have some nice cross paths for the purpose of forging. So these guys are going to do a lot of heavy lifting of forging for you, and you're going to be getting cheap items. Good for trading and things if you're in a multiplayer game, but otherwise just good for making sure that the cheaper the item is, the bigger the percentage of discount you're ending up with. So you can make the most of what people call trinkets, those 5 gem items, and maybe they'll go on some of the units we've talked about potentially being thugs so far. Next up, you have the Journeyman Runesmith, and the Journeyman Runesmith has a very specific job. He is very similar to the Runesmith, and you look at these paths and you go, oh, hello, this guy actually, for 220 gold, this guy looks a lot better than the Runesmith. He's only a level 1 priest, but these paths are very nice. This random is also very nice. It's the same 100% random that the other two had. He's also stealthy because he can travel underground using the different types of survival, although I think this one doesn't have swimming. However, he has a penalty of -2 to all non-holy magical paths in combat, so he's not really going to be a combat mage. You can do things with communions to get these up. Because it's -2, I don't know that that's going to be worth it. When this was back at -1, I did hear of people using him as their main battle mage and using communion items. I'm not sure they're going to be able to at -2. If they are, maybe I'll move it to -3 at some point. So he's not a very good battle mage, and he's also not good at forging because he's got Master Smith -2, so he loses 2 to all his paths for the purposes of forging as well. He also doesn't have a forge discount, and he even has Master Ritualist -2, so he loses 2 to 2 levels in all of his paths for the purpose of casting rituals. He's also not a very efficient researcher. You get 17 for 220, which is just slightly better than the Runesmith. So not your most gold efficient researcher. What he does do is let you site search. He's just fantastic at site searching. For 220 gold, you're getting 1 fire, 1 air, 1 water, 2 earth, 1 astral, and then potentially getting 3 earth, 2 astral, or 2 fire from his random. So you have these journeymen go around and find all the magic sites for you. And it takes the pressure off site searching considerably from all your other mages. This is just a specialist site searching mage, which really is a nice thing to have because yeah, you're just going to end up with good gem income from him finding a lot of these basic sites. Now, he has difficulty getting the higher level things, getting up to a higher level than like finding a Water 3 site, things like that. Although you can potentially give him some crafted items and boosters to increase his levels in those just for the purpose of finding sites. But yeah, they are just great for walking around. It's like a mini rainbow that you can build. So I always have a few of these guys off for site searching. And because they're not bad researchers at all, you can then just have them research for the rest of the game. So finally, we have our capital only mage. They cost 4 recruitment points, as you would expect. They are very expensive at 400 gold, but they do have the same abilities as the runesmiths. They have Forge bonus 1, they have Mastersmith, they are not affected by drain scales, and they have excellent paths. So we have 1 fire, 3 earth, and then 2 100% randoms of these spread. So this is the way to get into earth and water, basically. You can get air 2 or water 2 in theory from them, although it's a little bit difficult. 1 in 5 of them is earth 4, and even with their -1 penalty to magical paths in combat, they're still going to end up at earth 3 in combat then if they started at earth 4. So there's still quite a few things they can do. They can get up to earth 4 with earth power and kind of do some big earth spells. So they're going to be able to do some battle magic for you. They're going to give you fantastic forging. That's their main thing because of the Master Smith. If you manage to get, 2 water, you're at 3 water. 2 air, you're at 3 air. But even if you get 1 air, 1 water, then you're at 2 water, 2 air in terms of forging. You can get some nice crosspaths because you've got the astral in there as well. So yeah, fantastic forgers. They are 4 recruitment points, but of course you have 3 recruitment points, 3 command points in your capitals and upgraded forts, so that's not quite as severe a penalty as the other nations that have it. I think it's a good idea to recruit several of these. They're not very efficient researchers overall, but they're not terrible, I suppose. But yeah, their job should pretty much just be cranking out the forging. Sometimes they'll do a bit of site searching for you. If you get one that's got like a 2 water or something, you might want to use it instead of the Journeyman Runesmith, but I think that's kind of a waste of them. And then later on, as they get boosters and you're doing more things in combat, they're going to be battle mages as well. They're also Holy 3s, which of course lets you claim thrones, do Divine Blessing, do smites early in the game, a lot of useful stuff. So I think they are fantastic, and you should get more of them than you would typically get if you're capital only 4 recruitment point mages, because of your 3 command points you have. So that is all of your recruitable commanders. Then there's a couple of summons which I'm only going to look at briefly because I'll be talking about them when I'm talking about the national spells instead. So the national summon commanders are the Kingly Dwarf Ancestor Spirit, which is basically a pumped up version of an Ancestor Spirit. It's basically just better in a variety of ways, and you can get these through some events. I think there's a spell by which you can get them as well, but they are commanders rather than being troops like the Ancestor Spirits. And then there's also the Rune Lord with Anvil. This doesn't have any magic paths for some reasons that I'll talk about when I talk about the national spells, But a crucial thing about the Rune Lords and Anvils is that they have casting speed 150% of normal, which is very, very nice, and they don't lose any magical. Sorry, my headset cut out there. They don't lose any magical paths or power in battle. So then we have some heroes to look at. Now, as normal, I have separated these into luck-based multi-heroes, so they are modified. Their chance of appearing is modified based on your misfortune or luck scale. If you have misfortune 3, you will never see any of them. If you have luck 3, I believe you have a 6% chance each turn of a multi-hero turning up, so pretty strong. Your multi-heroes are a Demon Slayer, and Demon Slayers are Dragon Slayers who have managed to slay a dragon, probably a small one, and then they have been tasked with slaying a greater demon. And Demon Slayers are what you would expect. They're very souped up, pumped up Dragon Slayers. It basically goes from Troll Slayer, Giant Slayer, Dragon Slayer, and then Demon Slayer is the absolute zenith of this profession because they will die fighting demons, well, greater demons at least. They have a lot of fantastic abilities. They've got the same mark of Drengi. They can awaken tattoos in the same way, although they have Magic Bear Tattoo level 3, which means they get Invulnerability 15 and +3 strength if their tattoos are awakened. They also come with Fear 5. Their Berserk is now at 5, which of course makes their defense crash, but their attack skill is amazing. They have the Slayer rune axes, same as the Dragon Slayer, and they still have the same luck. And of course, they're sacred. Plus Affliction Resistance 4, which means they have a 1 in 5 chance of actually getting the Affliction when they normally would, 4 out of 5 chance of just ignoring it. So this is definitely in Thug Chassis contention now. Even though it doesn't have any magic paths, the combination of all of these abilities and things, like the luckiness, the fear, the fact you can get 15 vulnerability, the very hard-hitting built-in weapons, definitely you can try and make a thug out of these, and I think you can do rather well out of them. So it's fantastic to get them for a nation that can forge lots of items very easily and cheaply. So that's the Demon Slayer. There's the Rune Lord, which is your capital only mage I've just discussed. I like to have your expensive capital only mage be one of the multi-heroes that can turn up. And then you also have the Kingly Dwarf Ancestor Spirit, which I mentioned earlier, can turn up as a multi-hero. Just like the Demon Slayer, this is a fantastic thug chassis. It's got lots of abilities that are great, like ethereality, the fact that it floats, the fact that it's fast compared to most dwarves, the fact that it has Fear 5, it's sacred. It's got pretty good equipment to begin with. It's 25 hit points, it's not bad. Excellent stats overall, so you can definitely do some thugging with the Ancestor Spirits as well. You couldn't really ask for a better mundane chassis, and I would consider them to be, they're kind of along the lines of like if you were tooling up a Bane Lord or a Bane, maybe more on the Bane side because they're lower hit points. But they don't have the disadvantage of being undead, they do have the disadvantage of being magic beings. So then we have our Dwarf Luck Independent heroes. So these are events which are not tied to your luck scale or misfortune scale. You've got quite a big selection, which means that you will see some of these during the game, although of course you're not going to see all of them most likely. You might have like a 2% chance each turn of a particular one turning up, and a lot of them are restricted to not turning up too early into the game because they're very strong. The strongest two out of these are definitely the High King of Karaz-Karak and the Rune Lord of the Anvil. Although the Master Rune Lord is also very strong as well. So those three are kind of in a different tier from the others. I just want to note that I've turned the background off as I'm recording this because I was having some quality problems. You may notice during this video there's a little bit of stuttering and things. It shouldn't matter too much because we're just looking at units, but I'm going to change some settings, so hopefully that will stop now. Let's start by looking through the less strong, more kind of mundane heroes that you can get. The first is the Slayer King. This is Ungrim Iron Fist. So he is a combination between a king, so he's got the higher protection and very nice equipment. He's got a particularly nice axe. But at the same time, he is a slayer who has taken the slayer vow, and his vows of kingly duty to his people and his vow to die a glorious death through intention. And he doesn't behave exactly like a slayer commander does, like the demon slayer or dragon slayer. He doesn't have tattoos. He doesn't activate the tattoos of slayers that are nearby. But he does have berserk. He does have slaying on his axe. and he does have similar stats to the other Slayers. He's really a combat beast who's capable of. You can see his weapon damage is very, very high, and it's a magic weapon. He's sacred, of course, and he's capable of absolutely wrecking things in close combat. He's also very, very fire resistant, so basically immune to fire damage. And he's a pretty good leader. He's got Inspirational 1 and Leadership 80. So kind of a good general and definitely in thug territory. He also comes with 4 miscellaneous slots, which is excellent. He can have a lot of different war gear that you can put in there, so you can make him quite a powerful combatant. Then there is the Engineer Guildmaster. Very similar to Engineers, but with better siege bonus and cast defense bonus. He casts aim on battle start the same as other Engineers. He has better equipment, and he has a particularly nasty long-ranged arbalest. But in general, a souped-up version of an Engineer, I would say. There is the Master Brewer. He is a cross between a Thane and a Ranger Captain, I would say. He's one of the less individually very strong heroes, but he does come with a bunch of Rangers, and most of the Mundane Commanders come with some troops in the event, kind of a personal retinue. And he's got stealth, being a kind of a Ranger Captain, but I would say that his strongest 2 things are he casts Fanaticism on battle start. Fanaticism is basically Servant of Courage for all friendlies on the battlefield. So because the Dwarfs have very good morale, it's slightly less important than it would be for other races. He also has, because of his tankard, which contains his famous Bugman's, is it Bugman's Triple X? I can't remember. Bugman's 4X, I think. His famous ale, beloved ale. And his tankard is magical, and it gives him the ability to heal himself and heal the afflictions of other units. So he's got twice as much healing as a Priestess of Valaya, which is quite nice. Plus, in battle, every turn this automatically casts the Healing Ale spell, which is basically a modified version of Healing Touch. So he can heal nearby units that have taken damage using that. There is potential for you to be able to do something clever with that, where he's keeping a very tough, like a pretender going by constantly healing them. He's quite hard to kill just because he constantly heals himself, but it is a little bit hard because that's purely automatically going off to control exactly what happens with that, but it potentially could be quite strong. Oh, and he is the commander that turns up with a bunch of Bugman's Rangers, which are the kind of upgraded Rangers that have crossbows rather than throwing axes, and he's got some events where some more of Bugman's Rangers join him and help him out. So moving on, we have the King of Karakazul. This is another upgraded king. He's absolutely massive for a dwarf, which is why he has very high strength and lots of hit points. He has fear because he's carrying the Thunderhorn that he blows constantly, and this is another spell that another item that automatically casts a spell every turn. Automatically casts Panic, which can be useful for pushing the enemy's morale down and forcing break checks on them. Although Panic's not a very strong spell, so it's not a huge impact on the battlefield, but he is himself very, very good at fighting. He's a great potential to be a thug. He's got very good equipment, and you can add he's got some slots free, not all of them free, because he has to be carrying his special hammer and the Thunderhorn and so on. But starts off with very high protection because he has very high basic natural protection. He's extremely tough, a kind of a dwarf carved out of stone almost. So yeah, kind of an upgraded king. Then there's another in this category of extremely good at fighting upgraded kings, and that is the True King of Eight Peaks, Belagor Ironhammer. He comes with fantastic equipment, kind of Ironbreaker level equipment, an excellent melee weapon like most of the Dwarven Kings do. He has very high leadership, 160, 5 squads, morale bonus, and of course he can do formations. He's also unsurroundable 4 because he's the absolute cream of the crop tier 4 military commander. He's just a terrifying single combatant. If you throw some more equipment on him, some more items on him, he can be absolutely brutal, definitely a thug. He is sacred, but he can't bless himself, so he'll have to bring someone along to bless him, and he doesn't have any magic paths, so he's never going to be absolute top of the line, what people call an SC, kind of a solo super combatant, but he is very strong. You can definitely do some good stuff with him. And then we have our 3 more powerful ones, so I'll start off with the Master Rune Lord. So Crag the Grim is old, but in his time, he's kind of the leader of all of the Rune Lords. He's got a massive amount of magical power, and unlike the others, he has discovered the secrets to not losing any magical paths or power in battle. So he can be used as an absolutely premier battle mage. These fantastic paths. He's also a Holy 3, of course. And the other great thing about him is that he comes with a forge bonus of 3 rather than a forge bonus of 1. So if you are forging trinkets, which are 5 gem items, and you've got a dwarven hammer, of course he can't carry the dwarven hammer. Actually, that's how this is kind of a balanced thing. He's basically got like a built-in dwarven hammer effect, but he cannot carry a dwarven hammer because he hasn't got the hand slots because he's got his own hammer. So yeah, he's basically like getting a free dwarven hammer forger, but he is a fantastic forger because of his paths and because of course he's got Mastersmith 1. The only thing to look out for him really is that he is old, so he may become diseased in winter, that kind of thing. But of course, you do have healers and the like who potentially help him. Then we've got the Rune Lord of the Anvil. So this is got a lot of things in common with the summoned Anvil of Doom Rune Lords that you can get, and their standard extra ability is they don't lose any magical paths or power in battle, and they cast at 150% of normal. And if you look at his paths, he is an even better battle mage than Crag the Grim. He can carry a dwarven hammer and has a forge bonus of 1, so he can get up to 3, same as Crag the Grim. And he's got various other things that he gets from standing on his anvil, such as reinvigoration, and shock resistance and fire resistance. Shock resistance 50, so completely immune to shock, and some fire resistance. Just very, very, very strong battle mage. Both he and Crag can't turn up very early into the game and are less likely in general to turn up than the other heroes. But this is kind of your premier, the absolute best hero you can get, although the one that I'm about to discuss next is definitely a contender for that. Yeah, he is also able to cast a spell that I'll talk about in the national spells bit that no one else can cast. It's just him that can cast it. He's the only one who has the knowledge, which is kind of an unusual thing I've done in the mod. So the final unique hero is the High King of Karazakarak, Thorgrim Grudgebearer. He is the King of Kings, the leader of all of the dwarf race, and he's got fittingly very, very, very good stats and abilities. So he is a priest level 3. He has recuperation. He has regeneration, 10%, which built in is fantastic. You can also get a ring of regeneration or an item that gives him regeneration, or potentially you could have somebody cast regeneration on him. He also has invulnerable 10 built in, which is one of the reasons that his protection is so high. He has good basic natural protection, but also has great armor. But you can see versus mundane attacks, 27, so he's got really fantastic protection. Unsurroundable 4 because he's absolute cream of the crop combat commander. And he puts out a huge number of attacks because he's being carried constantly on this throne by these throne bearers, elite kind of hammerer style guards who fight with their magical hammers. So they put out 4 attacks at a much lower skill level than him, but still very good. He has 2 attacks with his Axe of Grimnir, and that also has slaying. So absolutely devastating attacks coming from him. And yeah, very, very tough, and has 75 hit points, which is great for the regeneration he has and the extra regeneration you can potentially give him through bless, items, and spells. You can stack it all. And yeah, in combat, he is an absolute monster and extremely hard for the enemy to take down. A good thing to get on him is some reinvigoration through one of these misc slots. He also automatically casts a magic resistance negates version of Doom on the start of battle. So Doom is a spell, high research spell, astral spell, which it curses every single enemy unit in battle, so regardless of their resistances, magic resistance, whatever. But this version of it, because it would be a bit too strong to automatically curse everyone that you're fighting, it only curses people who fail a magic resistance check. But it's still very strong. Curse means they're just more likely to pick up afflictions. It kind of gives them bad luck for afflictions in combat, and it's particularly unpleasant to have on your Titans, Pretenders, Giant SCs, things like that. So, very strong selection of heroes. Yeah, let's move on to talking about the national spells and then the national items, and then finally I will talk about scales a bit. In fact, before I talk about the national spells and items and scales, I thought I'd quickly look at the Pretender selection, I'm not going to go exhaustively through these, but there are 3 national pretenders, and I just wanted to show people the kind of range of pretenders that are available. So it's mostly things that are a little bit Nordic themed, that are underground themed, such as some of these Agarthan pretenders, that are mentioned living in the underworld or in the depths. Not that many things that are flying. They do have dragons, because I think dwarfs kind of have a level of respect for dragons, even though some of them spend their time trying to slay them. And then they've got 3 national pretenders. So I'll look at those quickly. So the first is the Brother of War, and he is kind of a souped up slayer. He's the progenitor of the Slayers. So he's got Slayer rune axes and a slaying ability. He has Berserk and various other abilities. He cannot do any smithing. He doesn't want to do any of that, despite having magic. Yeah, generally, I would say that the National Pretenders possibly a bit strong. I'm not sure. That's something that I want to look at and see if they're maybe a bit too strong or too good. But he can't do rituals and he can't do smithing of any kind. He can just do some battle magic and the like. He has oh, sorry, I was going to say he can do battle magic, but he can't do battle magic because he is berserk in every single battle. So these paths are just for the purposes of bless, really, since he can't do rituals, can't do smithing. I suppose he could do sight searching, but that's not really what you want to use him for. So the rune of Grimnir that he comes with makes him gone berserk, gives him attack and strength. Yeah, and gives him this built-in kind of flying shield, the runic ward, that will help him avoid some missile fire. So if you want a pretender that can go off and smash things in the face and kill things, and particularly is good at killing other pretenders, then possibly the Brother of War is one to go for. I don't have a huge amount to say about that. The Father of Runes is more of a kind of traditional rainbow pretender of sorts, although he can't. It's very expensive for him to get new paths, so he's more, restricted to these. So perhaps more of a Titan actually. He's less good in a fight, although he does have very good equipment and a very good shield. He has 2 shields, in fact, protecting him, because this is kind of a bonus shield floating around and helping him. And he comes with a 20% forge bonus and a Master Smith 1. So if you want a pretender that is able to forge things for you, for this nation that's already good at forging, particularly if you give him a Dwarven Hammer, he'll get a discount of 2 built in from the Dwarven Hammer, but then he gets that 20% discount. And the reason that 20% discount is better than like a 1 gem or 2 gem or 3 gem discount is that if you're building very expensive items, then of course you get a discount of more gems. He comes with the Rune of Grungni built in, which casts Legions of Steel at the outset of battle, which can be good if he's got some troops with him. He'll hit them with the Legions of Steel. Even if he's on his own, he gets a benefit from using it on himself, and it gives you the magic shield. And that is a forgeable item, as is the other rune that the Slayer, the Brother of War had. You can forge both of these, and I'll talk about those in the forged items. And then there's the Mother of All. She is an excellent healer, healer 5, and disease healer as well. And she's a very strong fortune teller also. So another kind of mage pretender, but one that would be more suited to kind of sitting in the capital a little bit, healing your troops and using fortune teller to prevent bad events from happening. And she comes with the Rune of Valaya. That's what gives her disease healing 1. You can make this, it's another forgeable national item, and it gives her, again, the kind of floating shield that helps her. Yeah. So I don't have a huge amount to say about them, but those are potential options you can use. I generally don't make pretenders for my mod nations because I think the Dominion selection is already very good, but these were made by Burn Saber, and I've kind of kept them in and made some tweaks to them, and I may make some further tweaks to make sure they stay relatively balanced with these other pretenders. See that they're all 150 points, and they all start at Dominion 2. Let's talk a bit about the national spells then. So in Conjuration, at level 4, so the same level as you get notable spells like summoning your fire drakes, flame jellies, wyverns, things like that. But before you get up to summoning the big elementals, you get the minor ambush. It's 3 earth to cast, so it's difficult for the dwarfs to cast in combat, but because of their reductions they get to battle magic, although of course they can use summon earth power to get up to it, and you get summon earth power at level 3 in Conjuration, so you will have that. It costs 2 gems, and what do you get? Well, you get 8 miners who will appear from the edges of the battlefield to attack the enemy. I believe they can't appear from the back of the battlefield, it's just from the top and bottom of the battlefield, but just having enemies, if your enemies are not expecting it, then it can be fantastic because they'll just come in and they potentially can snipe some mages, but they also just greatly disrupt enemy plans. It's very similar to what you get from Howl, although I think Howl can appear at the back of the battlefield. Corpse Candle, Will-o'-the-Wisp, very good disruption spell. It's very nice for them to have that available. And of course, 8 miners is not to be sniffed at. Miners are pretty good troops. They're kind of medium to heavy infantry and they hit very hard, which is nice. And they've got good morale. So yeah, I think pretty solid for 2 gems, something that I would bring to any big battle. And it's not a battlefield enchantment. You can have multiple mages cast it, so you just have tons of miners appearing all over the place. I would say a very strong spell, and definitely one that you will want to kind of almost go out of your way to cast. And because you want to get summon Earth Power, you'll probably be going up in Conjuration anyway, and potentially you could be going up to get the Fire Elemental spells and the like. It is very fatiguing because it's 3 Earths, so that's something to bear in mind. But again, you'll have the reinvigoration, possibly from your Bless and definitely from Summon Earth Power. Then in Evocation at level 3, so the same level as Fireball, kind of the iconic Evocation spell at a low level, you have Grudgestone. Grudgestone is Earth 1 to cast, and you require Holy, so it's castable by your runesmiths and the like, but it's not castable by the Runesmith Apprentice because they're not a level 1 priest, they're just sacred. And Grudgestone, it fires 2 or more stone projectiles. They're somewhat accurate, but not that accurate. They do quite a bit of damage because you add the strength of the caster, so they end up doing, significant amount of damage. Could be up around 30 damage potentially. And then they also have an extra effect of Grudge Panic, which is the same as the Panic spell, but in a small area of effect. So it's not a huge impact, but it can reduce the morale of the enemy. And they also curse the people that they hit. So I would say pretty good. Evocation spell, as it says here, powerful projectile, cast Panic and Curse in an AoE2 where it impacts. Good at cursing people. It's unresistible curse, which is nice. I've definitely killed things with Grudgestone before. Against things that are very tough and have very high protection, it's not great. And of course, it is evocation, and at longer ranges, it's fairly likely to miss the thing that you're aiming at because it's not that precise, and dwarves are not very high precision casters. But it's not terribly fatiguing or anything to cast. Yeah, it's not bad. I would say it's probably a better thing for just random mages who are able to cast than to try and cast Fireball because it's only 1 Earth and you're more likely to have more Earth. So it's not kind of a late game spell, but something useful. It can deter enemy awake pretenders, things like that, because it can curse them and do a lot of damage. Yeah, pretty strong. Then in construction, which is definitely a school that you'll be researching in because of all your forge bonuses and discounts. So you'll definitely be wanting to get up into these greater magic items, very powerful magic items, probably going to go all the way up to the top. And you may also want to get Forge of the Ancients and Weapons of Sharpness, I would say, would be targets for you. You have at level 3, so in between getting lesser magic items and greater magic items, Outfit Iron Drakes, which is 1 fire, 1 earth. Very easy for you to cast. You've got plenty of mages to cast that. 9 fire gems, and you do have a good fire gem income in your capital, and especially as you upgrade your sites. And you get 4 iron drakes, which are, we've looked at them previously. They're very similar to iron breakers, but they've got that area of effect fire attack as well, so good against anything where you need to have these extra troops at very high protection, and if there's lots of massed enemies, they can burn up with their fire. And then we've got basically the same spell, but harder to cast because it's earth and air, so probably a Rune Lord is who's going to be casting this. Outfit Thunderers for 9 earth gems, and you've got plenty of earth gems, and you get 4 Thunderers, so very similar to the Iron Drakes, but very different mission for the Thunderers. They're there to do armor negating shock damage rather than lots of fire damage. Then finally, we have some spells in enchantment, but you'll have to get up to level 6 before you see the first of them. So this is more late game stuff. Enchantment level 6 is attractive because you might want to be going up to cast Riches from Beneath, which of course gives you more resources to pump out more of your dwarfs. Particularly, you could start making a lot of Iron Breakers if you get Riches from Beneath going. Debts Unpaid is 2 Astral and requires Holy 3, so basically it's for Rune Lords to be casting. It costs 15 Astral Pearls, And for casting Debts Unpaid, you get what is effectively a Ritual of Rebirth. So it picks a dead commander out of the Hall of Fame, one of your people who've got into the Hall of Fame and died, and then it brings them back, but not with their original body. Instead, it gives them the body of a kingly ancestor spirit. So this can be good if you've got a particularly strong commander who's died and got into the Hall of Fame. You can bring them back. The kingly ancestor spirit, as I've showed before, is a very strong chassis. Yeah, so this can be very good, I would say, to bring back if you lose a particularly good commander. I think if they have magic paths, and they will come back with their magic paths in the kingly ancestor form. So maybe if a very powerful Rune Lord goes, or one of your national heroes goes, you can bring them back with Debts Unpaid. I think a thing that's worth noting with Debts Unpaid is that if you bring back one of, let's say, your Rune Lords that dies and they come back with their magic, that they will no longer, when they're in battle, have that -1 to all of their magic paths in magic in battle, so you can use it to make a much stronger battle mage. But of course, you will also lose your ability to be a Master Smith and get a forging discount. So they will no longer be as good for forging. Then at level 7, we have 4 primal runes, they're called, which are the runes of the various elements, and the Master Rune of Doom, and the spell Activate Anvil of Doom. So these are battlefield spells, these 5, and this is a ritual. So let's look at the ritual first, Activate Anvil of Doom. So this is 38 Earth Gems to cast, so relatively expensive. It costs 4 Earth and 3 Holy, so it's basically going to be cast by your Rune Lords, and I believe the Rune Lords it might be restricted to only Rune Lords. Yes, can only be cast by Rune Lords, so that's officially hard coded in there as well. And what do you get? Well, you get 6 Rune Guard are summoned up, and you also transform your caster, the Rune Lord, into an Anvil of Doom. Does not cause the loss of any slots, and the Anvil of Doom does not lose paths in battle and has increased casting speed. So we looked before at the Anvil of Doom, and we can go back and have a look at it right now. So going back to the preview sites for the Dwarf Summons, we can see this is the Anvil of Doom, the Rune Lord with Anvil. And it doesn't have any magic paths because this is something that your Rune Lord turns into, so it keeps whatever magic paths your Rune Lord has. It still has Master Smith 1, it still has a Forge bonus of 1. They now have Reinvigoration and the casting speed is increased, and it doesn't lose magical paths or power in battle. So the crucial thing really is that you're turning a Rune Lord from this chassis that gets this -1 across the board to its paths in battle into one that has Reinvigoration and has some bonuses to some other stats, casts faster, and doesn't lose any of those paths. So it massively increases their ability to be useful battle mages. Particularly 150% casting speed is fantastic for getting those early spells off that are, Weapons of Sharpness, Army of X, things like that you want to get off as soon as possible. So is it worth 38 Earth Gems to turn one of your Rune Lords into these? I would say yes, and particularly because it opens up the much greater chance of them being able to cast the primal runes that you get at the same level. So let's take a look at those. Back to enchantment level 7, we've got the Rune of Fire. So 2 Fire and 3 Holy. If you've got a Rune Lord who had 2 Fire and they turn themselves into a Rune Lord on an Anvil of Doom, then they will definitely be able to cast this. And what this does is gives you effectively 7 or more fireballs. So it's basically exactly the same as Fireball, except you get more projectiles. I think there's a little bit extra precision. The damage is the same, but it's basically 7 or more fireballs that you're casting. And you can see that it's only possible, well, typically you can only do it with the Anvil of Doom, although technically you can do it some other ways. If you have a Rune Lord and you can get them to have 2 fire in combat, then you can use Rune of Fire from the Rune Lord without using the Anvil of Doom, but definitely the Anvil of Doom is a better way of getting to it, I think. Rune of Thunder is similar, except instead of it being 7 fireballs, it is 3 Thunder Strikes, which is obviously pretty devastating, although they do have shorter range. I believe the fireballs have shorter range as well. Rune of Water doesn't have an equivalent spell. It's not like Thunderstrikes or Fireballs, but it does an area effect 7 or greater bunching of earth meld, slime, and slowing of the enemy. So this can be great for dealing with elite enemies and disrupting their formations. Holding them in place and blasting with other stuff, and obviously holding them in place is particularly nice for the dwarfs with their slow speed and very hard-hitting units. Then the Rune of Earth. So this is exactly the same as the vanilla spell, the base game spell Curse of Stones, except that it's an area effect rather than hitting the whole battlefield, and there's no magic resist roll on it. Now, Curse of Stones, I believe, is magic resist negates easily, or magic resist negates, but either way, a lot of the enemies are just not going to be affected by Curse of Stones when you cast it typically, but with the Rune of Earth, everything in an area effect of 9 definitely will get the Curse of Stones, and Curse of Stones basically just increases the fatigue that they end up taking in battle, so I wouldn't say that this is the strongest of them, but it's the easiest for you to cast because you're going to have high earth. You can probably cast this with Rune Lords without having the Anvil of Doom because you've got high earth, and then even if you're having -1, you can always cast Summon Earth Power to get to this. So yeah, this is more generally useful. You're going to be able to cast it, and it's less fatiguing than the others, but I would say it's less strong. Probably the strongest is the Rune of Thunder, but you're also not going to have a huge number of things to have Air 2 in combat. That's someone we really do need the Anvil of Doom to cast it. And then finally we have the Master Rune of Doom. The Master Rune of Doom is only castable by the Rune Lord of the Anvil, which is Thoric Ironbrow, a national hero. This is extremely strong spell though. It costs 3 Astral to cast and it's 3 Astral Pearls. So in order for Thoric to cast it, I believe he's going to have to use Power of the Spheres or an item to boost up his Astral level or some kind of communion that he set up. So he has to do a bit of boosting to get to it, but when you do cast it, you get 12 of those Ancestor Spirits, which is already very, very strong for a spell like this, battlefield spell. They'll appear next to you. You also get Darkness. That's exactly the same as the base game Darkness spell, which is nice because your dwarfs have Dark Vision. Your Ancestor Spirits, I believe, have 100% Dark Vision. So while it is slow to cast and extremely tiring, which is definitely true, it has a very long casting time, being able to get Darkness without going down death to get it, and having those 12 Ancestor Spirits is very strong, and you should basically win battles where you're getting off the Master Rune of Doom, so very, very strong, but you've only got one mage that can cast it and you will get knackered. So if he does get very tired out from casting it and then you do lose the battle, there's a reasonably high chance that he'll end up getting chopped up, although he does have Reinvigoration, and maybe you've got Reinvigoration in your Bless, and maybe he's cast Summon Earth Power beforehand to deal with the large amount of fatigue he'll end up from this spell. So a nice selection of very strong spells, and I guess it really recommends that you get up to Enchantment 7. That's very important for the dwarfs. Getting up Construction is obviously very important, and then maybe you want to go up Conjuration to get. You definitely want Summon Earth Power, but you may also want to go up Conjuration and get the Minor Ambush spell. The Dwarf Nation also comes with a variety of national items, which is something that all of these were made by Burn Saber, and I've kind of tweaked them a bit and maybe cleaned up the graphics in some places. But it's not typically something that I add to Mod Nations because the base game already has a lot of forgeable items. But it is cool that the dwarfs get them because they are particularly interested in forging. So let's just go through their forgeable national items. So first, in the lesser magic items, so this is Construction Research Level 2, we have the Crossbow of Immolation. This is very similar to the Just Man's Cross, except that the targets that it hits and then gets to do large amounts of damage to, and it's magical fire damage if it manages to hurt them with its main shot. Yeah, it works on everything. It's not just restricted to undead and demons that it can hurt, so you get a pretty accurate and powerful kind of arbalest style shot or crossbow style shot, and then if you do manage to damage them with that, then you do a massive amount of armor negating fire damage. So it could potentially be useful against super combatants, maybe against some elite stuff, and it's cheap. You can make it just 2 fire gems, so if your enemy isn't packing anti-fire, fire resistant things like that, giving their powerful units resistance against fire, then maybe you can get some of these out. Yes, with the Dwarven Hammer and your Forge discount, you can get it for 2 fire gems, so you can crank out quite a few of these. Then there's the Ironbringer Gauntlets, so this is another 2-handed weapon. It is basically, it gives you a couple of attacks that are not terribly strong, like magical punches, and that's not very interesting. But the interesting thing that it does is it automatically casts Fist of Iron twice every round in battle, every single round. So you can sit there, even if you're completely asleep, fatigued out, the gauntlets will keep going and just absolutely pounding on things. Fist of Iron does a huge amount of physical damage. I don't think they count as magical, spell Fist of Iron. But yeah, it just constantly pumps out these hits. So I think that can be very strong. Consequently, it's more expensive, so you can't get it as a very cheap item, but you can still get your 3-gem discount on it. Then moving up into very powerful magic items. So this is that's construction level 2. This is construction level 4. This is construction level 6. We then have the Axe of Smiting. So this is a very expensive kind of premier item for your expensive combat unit. Thugs, super combatants, pretenders maybe, and it's two-handed, so it's quite a commitment. It's fire 2 and astral 2, so it's 10 of each. It hits very hard. It is armor piercing. It has nice stats on it. That's all fine, but it's like a great sword of sharpness at that point. But also, anything that it hits, it will then do an area effect 1 smite, which is armor negating. It's very similar to the spell smite basically, but it hits everything in an area effect of 1, and it is difficult to negate with magic resistance rather than just being possible to negate with magic resistance. So it's pretty reliably going to be whacking things for 20 armor negating damage in an area effect of 1 as you're hitting things with the Axe of Smiting. Then in shields, we have at construction level 6 the Shield of the Dwarf Hold. So this gives you Holy Avenger in every battle, which is the normal priest spell. You actually have a minus to your reinvigoration, so it tires you out as you hold it, but it gives you stone skin, and it is a good shield. So basically this is a way of getting the stone skin effect that you would get from Boots of Stone usually in the shield slot and getting a shield at the same time. So if you're not too worried about the reinvigoration, this can be a good one. But you do have to keep an eye on reinvigoration -2, of course. Then in helms, we have the steel build helm, and that's a construction 4. This is a helmet that gives you 100 dark vision, so perfect dark vision and spirit sight, and it gives you invulnerability of 15, so that's protection against mundane non-magical attacks at 15 built in, so it can be very good on things that have already got a lot of armor because of the way they stack into minions. It's 3 earth magic, which is obviously no trouble at all for you to forge, but 15 earth gems is quite expensive. And it's just kind of a good hat that you can wear. So really, this is just a way of getting invulnerability on the head slot, but that can be a very useful thing to do. Then in the armor slot, and this is at construction level 4 as well, there's the Mail of the Peaks. This is quite similar to the Rime Halberd, which is at a higher research level, in that it's kind of this ice-themed armor. This one gives you cold resistance 10, which is very useful. It gives you ice protection 2, which means, according to the cold scales, it gets you higher and higher protection. It's stronger and stronger. And it also gives you cold power 1, which is quite transformative because it means you get +3 to lots of your stats in cold 3, but you would get -3 to lots of your stats in heat 3, and the same for other things on the spectrum. So it makes quite a big difference in where you would use this. You definitely want to be using this in cold climates. It's not terribly expensive. It's 10 gems in total. And the unique thing that it does is it casts Freezing Touch every round in battle. So obviously that's another way of putting out not an attack but damage. And Freezing Touch is a pretty damaging cold damage spell. So if they don't have cold resistance, that's going to mess things up pretty nicely. Then in the boot slot at construction level 4, we have the Miner's Greaves. Miner's Greaves gives you reinvigoration 3, +4 strength, poison resistance 5, and water breathing. And it gives you all of this in the boot slot for 10 gems. I think that's pretty great, and this is something I would be making quite a lot of to give my guys more reinvigoration, particularly if using, say, the Shield of the Dwarf Hold. You can counteract that reinvigoration loss by having the Miner's Greaves. Having the water breathing is great because it enables you to build your thugs that can then go underwater and take underwater provinces for you. The poison resistance is nice to have. The strength is just nice to have. But I think really you're looking at something that gives you a variety of bonuses and gives you the reinvigoration without you having to go into nature to get Boots of the Messenger, which is not really something that dwarves are particularly good at doing. Then moving into miscellaneous items, this is where we have the most forgeables. There's 6. So these are the 3 runes that appeared on the Pretender, the 3 different Pretenders, and each of them gives you this rune shield, which is kind of an extra bonus flying shield that helps you out, and it can really make a big difference to your survivability. They're all cursed, and I believe they can't be picked up by other things, but basically you can't take them off once you put them on. They take up a misc slot, so you have to be a bit careful with them. But they are cheap, and they give you some useful things, like being berserk and having more attack skill and strength, having Legions of Steel cast at the start of every battle. This is why this is more expensive than the other one, because that's a stronger effect, having Legions of Steel. Getting the shield, of course, still. And then giving you Disease Healer 1. I think that this one I'm going to have to reevaluate a bit, because I think 10 Astral is a bit much for Disease Healing 1, now that they've got the Priestess of Valaya, who is a straight healer. So yeah, disease healing is less impressive for them. So I think I'll probably rebalance this or change what it does a little bit. So I wouldn't recommend building this at the moment. Then at construction level 4, we've got 3 more misc items. One of them is the lightning hammer. So you might think, oh, well, why doesn't this go in a hand slot? Well, because it's just an extra missile weapon that your commander gets. So it gives them the ability to throw a lightning hammer, which does a decent amount of damage itself. It's just a throwing weapon they can throw. There's 7 ammunition on it. And then where it lands, you get a 10 armor negating shock damage area effect 1 attack. So pretty strong. If you put it on something that's got, put it on a commander and give them quite good precision, then they can really wreck some stuff up with this. It also gives you shock resistance plus 10 on a misc slot, which is nice to have. So I would say this is very strong, and I would be planning on building quite a few of them if I was the dwarfs. The downside of it is that it takes air gems, which are kind of at a premium for the dwarfs. You may not have that many. Your capital doesn't give you any air gems. It's not difficult for you to get a rune lord that can forge this, because they got Master Smith, but it's just that the gems are worth quite a lot for you. Then there's the map of the Underway. So this is an item which, if you are killed in battle, it can't be found by anyone else, and it actually explodes if you die. It gives you Reinvigoration 1, which is okay but negligible. But the main thing is just that it gives you extra map move. Yeah, it's just a way of, in a misc slot, getting a little bit of Reinvigoration and extra map move to get your dwarfs around quickly. So I would build it some of the time, I think, if you particularly want to have the extra map move. It's nice because it's not cursed. You can hand it around between different commanders to move them between forts and things, but it's not as good as like a Boots of Flying or anything. But the fact it goes in a misc slot is quite nice. And then finally, there's the Book of Grudges at Construction 4. So this one is quite expensive, 10 Earth Gems and 10 Astral Gems, pretty expensive. But what it gives you is very strong. So it gives you regeneration 10%, which is obviously very strong to have in a miscellaneous slot and to have it without using nature gems. That's very attractive. And it means that you are permanently blessed. So it acts like a prophet of the Shroud of the Prophet from the base game. And this can be used by things that aren't dwarfs. It is cursed, so you can never take it off once you put it on. But you may want to take this on a pretender. If you've got your Titan and they want to get out there and they want to have regeneration, you may want to take it on them. Although the bless would be a bit less attractive on them. I guess it would allow them to be blessed outside their own dominion. You may want to use it on a summon of some kind that isn't sacred to get the benefit from that. A lot of your best commanders are sacred, but not all of them are. So there are some that you can use it on. Maybe you've got a particularly good Thane who would benefit from this. It does have a very big downside in that it gives you reinvigoration -2, because again, it's a big burden for them to be carrying around the Book of Grudges. So you do have access to reinvigoration items, and obviously you can counteract that to some extent, but something to bear in mind. So that is all of their forgeable items, and I will now talk a little bit about scales and about their special site upgrading mechanic that they have. Here I have fired up a test game so that I can show you the mechanic of upgrading their sites by. So what they do is they find sites in mountain or cave provinces out there in the world. You protect them for long enough, and eventually they will be essentially transported back to upgrade one of your home sites. And this represents the dwarfs reclaiming some old territory, some old ruins which contain, for them, this kind of golden age technology, these golden age resources, and then they'll slowly build an underground passage to take it all safely home, and then they'll collapse the other end of the passage so the enemy can't get hold of it. If the enemy do get hold of the sites, there's one of them here, Lost Grumrill Reserve. So there's Lost Grumrill Reserve, Lost Ancient Forge, and Lost Gold Reserve. When you get these, they give you a benefit. So you're getting a gem and some resources. You could get some gold. You can get a gem from the Forge one as well. If you lose this province at all, ever, even for just one turn, this site will disappear and it will never appear again. And each of these only appears 3 times, so you can find 3 lost Gromrel reserves, and you can use those if you can keep them protected, and they'll eventually be pulled back to your capital. And you have to keep your capital safe as well to do this. Actually, I should mention that you need to have full control of the province, so you need to have control of the province, not be under siege there, and you also have to have positive dominion there for them to be transported home. So you can meet all the criteria here, so this one could be transported back to our home base at any turn. When they're transported back, they will upgrade your starting sites. You have 3 starting sites. They start at tier 1, the base level, where they don't do anything pretty much. I think the Bolt of Gromril gives you maybe a little bit of resources at the start, but the other ones don't do anything. And I've got examples of one here that has been upgraded once. So the Grand Forge Kindled, this has been upgraded once, so it goes from giving you nothing to giving you 1 fire gem per turn. So that's from finding and protecting and then transporting home 1 lost ancient forge. At tier 2 here, tier 3 rather, here is the Vault of Gold Resplendent. So it has been upgraded twice. So instead of giving you no gold, I think it goes no gold and then it gives you 60 and then it gives you 120. So you've upgraded your capital to get a significant amount of extra gold there by protecting those sites. And here is one that is fully upgraded, the Vault of Gromril Eternal. So this is if you have found, protected and transported home 3 lost Gromril reserves. And this now gives 3 Earth Gems extra per turn, produces 125 resources, which is very nice. And because it is tier 4, it enables the recruitment of 2 Iron Drakes per turn, just in the capital, mind you. So you can get the 2 Iron Drakes per turn at tier 3 as well. So once you've upgraded the site twice, you start getting those, but you keep that when you go to the final upgrade for the site as well. So very welcome to have those. You can get 2 Thunderers a turn if you get your Grand Forge Grand Forge upgraded. It goes Grand Forge Kindled, Grand Forge Incandescent, and then Grand Forge Eternal, I believe. But when it's incandescent, you get 2 fire gems per turn, and you will also get the Thunderers that you'll be able to build 2 of your capital each turn. So yeah, very welcome. You can see here if I recruit units that the Iron Drake is available to recruit, but only 2 per month. So the main thing to bear in mind here, I would say, is just that you need to get hold of those sites by getting to places that have mountains and caves, which is more important for you. You have to get your dominion there, and you have to protect them. If you don't, you will not get your site at home fully upgraded. Finally, let's talk just a little bit about scales. So I think the scales for the dwarves are actually, to some large extent, a little bit of a no-brainer, and hopefully they're very thematic. So I would say that the dwarves definitely want production 3. You almost always want to take that. It's very similar to Ulm. I guess you could get away with taking a little bit more. You definitely wouldn't want to go into Sloth, but I think giving you production 3, that is the most sensible thing to take. I think that you almost certainly want to take Drain 3 because your mages ignore the Research Malice from Drain. You could take Magic 3 and then build lots of apprentice runesmiths and try and get very, very good research. But given that you're getting Drain for free, I really would recommend it just to free up more points. You can use those points for blesses. You obviously have multiple Sacred Commanders, you have Sacred Thugs, and you have 3 different types of Sacred Recruits. Your capital only one is particularly good, but your other ones are fine as well, although they are quite different. If you were taking a bless for the Doom Seekers, you would probably want quite a different bless than the ones that you take on Rune Guard and Valkyries, for instance. Your temperature preference is to have 1 cold, but I think that most Dominions players would then consider it worthwhile to just move to 3 cold. It gives you more predictable weather, and I think people have done some kind of economic analysis on that, and it turns out that it's a good way of getting points without hurting your economy too much. Although it is worth bearing in mind that that will make your heavy infantry fatigue out a little bit faster, other than your Valkyries that have cold protection enough to ignore that, I believe. I would recommend for the dwarfs taking Order 3 because you are quite a gold hungry nation. may wish to take growth because of this. I think growth and misfortune or luck is very much up to the individual player. It's not really, I wouldn't say that death is thematic for the dwarfs. I wouldn't say that growth is particularly thematic for the dwarfs. They are in a decline, but it's a very slow decline. They're not all rapidly dying off or anything like that. It's more because of their enemies attacking them, a kind of inherent loss of their population or anything. And I think thematically the dwarfs, they don't have the best luck, so maybe I would take a bit of misfortune. And I think I would be more inclined to go for misfortune because you've already pretty much gone in for order rather than turmoil, and that reduces the amount of events. And if the events are bad, that's less of a bad thing. But a lot of people don't like misfortune, so maybe you would go neutral or take luck. But I think that these are the main things that I would take drain 3, that I would take order 3, that I would take production 3, and I would probably, if you're playing competitively, I would definitely say that this is a good way of getting extra points for blesses and Dominion and better scales and things. But thematically, maybe just sticking with one is the correct thing to do. Yeah, I'm not looking to give you more advice on whether you would want to take an Awake Pretender or Expand or anything like that. I think I will leave that as an exercise for the viewer. But these are pretty much what I would think be thematic scales. That is more or less everything I wanted to cover in this national overview. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you give the Dwarfs a try. I want to give a large amount of credit to Burnsaber, who originally made this mod for Dominions 3. He made the vast majority of the sprites. I've made a few, so for example, I made the Doomseeker sprite, I made the Valkyrie sprite, and I've tried to fit in with the style that he was going for. I think he did excellent work, and yeah, just a huge amount of credit to Burnsaber for doing what I would say is the majority of this. I will put a link in the description where you can download this mod and where you can discuss this mod. And yeah, I hope to have any feedback from you. You can feedback to me in the comments. You can find me on Discord. I am Somber on the various Dominions Discords. I keep an eye out for any mentions of my name. And yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed watching it and also that you've had a nice holiday season. So thank you for watching and bye for now.